how do you design an assessment with UDL in mind? Well, I'm going to give you 8 tips for designing UDL assessments. Tip number 1 is construct relevance. Now, constructs are skills, knowledge, or abilities that you're trying to measure through the assessment. So imagine you're giving students a math problem. Well, you wouldn't necessarily assess their ability to write a paragraph or construct a diorama, right? You wouldn't necessarily do that. So sometimes what happens is when we give assessments, we put unintended barriers up in this idea of construct irrelevance, right? So that's the very first thing that you need to think of. So a standards aligned choice board is a great tool that you can use to ensure that you are grading in a construct relevant way. So as you can see here, here's the academic standard and a learning goal. And what the students have is they have 3 different options for actually meeting that learning goal. Now, these are some of the things that they need to take into consideration, but they are not being graded. In fact, what we're doing here is we're using this idea of a single point rubric, and these are the 3 elements that are going to tell us whether students have met this particular standard or goal. So construct relevance is really important. It's sort of like going up a mountain. There are multiple pathways that you can use to get up to the top. And that's exactly what construct relevance is all about. Now, the other thing is that we want to identify potential barriers. And so when we're thinking in terms of barriers, think about engagement, representation, and action expression. A great way of doing this is taking a look at the UDL guidelines and thinking in terms of, well, what are some barriers that might get in the way of students engaging with content or how it's represented? So the UDL guidelines are going to be changing as of July 2024. This is the 2.3 version of the UDL guidelines, so it will look a little bit different, but the concept will still remain the same. So imagine we're thinking, you know what? Students are going to have trouble with language. That could be a big part, a barrier in that assessment. What we can do then is we can go to this UDL guideline and actually look at some checkpoints for some strategies that we could use. And maybe we already have some in mind to address this particular issue. The other thing is we want to plan for variability. All learners are different in the way that they learn and their needs and in their preferences. So using those different strategies that I just mentioned are extremely important. But even getting to know your learners a little bit better, that can help as well. So we've discussed things in the past called like a learner profile tool. And I wanted to share with you what this learner profile tool can possibly do. So a learner profile is a great way of getting to know your students and their strengths and their challenges. And this one in particular allows students to show, okay, this is how I like things represented, how I like to engage in the classroom, how I like to express my knowledge. This is what I prefer, and this is what I need. Now, you could always craft something a little bit different, but that's a great way of getting to know the variability in a room. The other thing is thinking in terms of scaffolds and supports. So there are many different types of scaffolds and supports that we use all the time. Think about going to an unfamiliar place and you use the GPS on your phone, or perhaps you don't necessarily know an answer, so you go Google it, or you turn to AI, or even you're typing up an email, and guess what? You're using this spell checker. We use scaffolds and supports all of the time, and there are 3 different types that we can use. There are more, but these are 3 basic types. Linguistic, helping out with language and constructing our understanding. Conceptual, helping us understand big ideas. And then social cultural, how we communicate and interact with one another. These types of scaffolds and supports are extremely helpful. Now let's take a look at an example of, well, maybe an example of a lesson that, well, wasn't necessarily very accessible. So when I go to this example right here, this is actually something that a teacher gave a few years ago. And this is on the water cycle, but there's a couple barriers that we can think about. One is vocabulary. Like, what are the actual terms? Are we grading their ability to spell, or are we grading their ability to, well, place the proper term in the proper spot? So what we decided to do is we decided to take that example and put it in a tool called ClassKick. Now, you could use a word bank or you could use a low-tech version of this. I just want to share with you a high-tech version that could be potentially helpful. So what we did is we actually went in and we said, okay, we want to add that particular picture from the our computer here. And so I'm going to go in and I'm going to add this. Now we wanted to get rid of some of the confusing areas right here. So we just got rid of some of these confusing areas and hit next, and finish. Now once we put this particular object in our document, we provided instructions. So you can use class kick to do that, to provide directions right here. And what was also really helpful was to add an audio version of those instructions. So we went right here and we actually recorded ourselves. This is the water cycle. You're going to move the proper term to its proper space on the water cycle diagram. All right, sorry about that. And so you're going to put this right here underneath the directions. Now, what about those vocabulary terms, right? Well, we used the manipulative feature here on Class Kick to basically do exactly that. We took those water cycle steps and we just said, oh, okay, precipitation is one. We have another one right here, evaporation. And then we also added condensation and runoff. Once we added all of those different types of examples right here, we shared this with students, and then what students did is they actually went through and they moved the proper term to the proper spot. We added other things as well, as like maybe a helpful link to help them remember the different parts of the water cycle, but that's an example of what you can use to add different types of scaffolds and supports. Here's another thing, thinking in terms of flexible options. So not every assessment is crafted the same, right? So you can have flexibility in the product or flexibility in the process, right? And so we've talked about this before. So flexibility in the product is being able to have a learning goal like this, explain the three major causes of the American Revolutionary War, and well, there's different ways of doing that. So we could create a PowerPoint presentation, an essay, or even a podcast. But sometimes you don't necessarily have that flexibility. You're flexible in the process. For example, if you're writing an essay, well, you might want to provide some different options for how students brainstorm, construct the essay, and even go through the peer editing process. Same thing with a math problem. You know, if you have a math problem, maybe there's different materials that you can use. Maybe there's different contexts that you can use to solve the same exact problem. The numbers might be the same, but maybe the context is different. Maybe instead of purchasing apples, you're purchasing Red Sox tickets, right? So let's share with you an example of how you could be flexible in the product or process with with this. So this is called Sharkbacks here, and this is an example of an article that we want students to read to, well, get the main idea. And so we want the students to discover the main idea and share the supporting details. What we can do is we can actually copy this and we can go into a tool like Magic School. Now, Magic School, if you aren't familiar with it, is a free tool that you can use to, well, do a lot of different things. In this particular example right here, we have a choice board. And so what we'll do is we'll give it the grade level and we'll say that in this particular example, it's third grade. And what we want to do is we want to determine the main idea and supporting details. And then what we can do is we can actually put this article in here, and I put that in there. I'm going to hit generate. And now what it's going to do is it's going to generate some different ideas that I can use, right? And so here are some different things that I could do. I could also, once again, I could go into, say, Gemini. I could go into Copilot and say, give me 3 different options for grading this. So that's one thing that I could do. Designing a rubric is really helpful as well with these particular tools. But what about, well, we don't have a whole lot of flexibility. Students need to take a quiz. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take this article and I'm going to go instead into Gemini. And so Gemini is Google's tool that you can use. It's an AI tool just like ChatGPT. And I'm going to put in here, okay, you're going to create a 5-question quiz on this. So I'm going to go ahead and hit submit. It's going to give me a quiz. So check this out. So it gives me some different types of options. Now, what I love about this is that I can simply go right down here and I can export it to Google Docs. So as I export it to Google Docs, well, I am going to open it up. And when I open it up, it's formatted this way. Now, if I wanted to change the formatting, I think that's probably a barrier that could possibly get in the way, right? You want to make sure that everything's formatted correctly. So I'm going to do a couple things here to make it, well, a little bit more accessible for my students. One is I'm going to use Lexend font. So if you're not familiar with Lexend, you can find it in more fonts. Simply go to Lexend, voila. And Lexend is a great font for students with visual difficulties, dyslexia, and that may need a little extra support. Well, why not give all students that support? I'm also going to space things out a little bit, so I'm going to do that, and I can really change a lot of different things on here, but I'm not going to focus on that since we are short on time. So another thing that I could possibly do here is I could change the background. Research has shown that if you change the background to a cream color, it actually helps students with reading comprehension issues. So here's my quiz, and so I have some different things going on here. Now look at the font. The font is very small, so I would want to make sure it's at least 14 point so that students can see it a little bit better. Other things too, you could possibly just, bold your questions, just so students could see things a little bit better. So let's imagine that I'm ready to go. I can go ahead and download this, and I'm going to download it as a PDF. I'm going to use that same tool that we used a few minutes ago, Class Kick, right? And so when I go into Class Kick, I'm going to go over here, and we're going to add that picture. So I'm going to go to my downloads folder, and here we go. And voila, here is my quiz, and I'm going to say, you know what, we're going to do these two questions right here. I'm going to hit next, next, and finish. Now, what I can do here is I can put this quiz right in here, and let's say, for instance, I have students in my class that need it read to them. Well, I could make that available very easily by simply doing this. Simply going to audio and saying, how many different types of sharks are there? A, around 100, B, around 400, C, around 1,000. Then I could go ahead and put this right here. And yes, any student would have access to reading that aloud. So the thing is the goal is for them to answer these questions. How they do it, well, we might provide them with some flexible options for doing that. Now, will students take advantage of this? Yes. Will students not use it? Yes. It's merely a preference that they can use because, well, our goal allows us to be flexible. If we don't have a flexible goal where students actually need to read these questions and answers and they can't have that scaffolder support, then don't put it down. But anyways, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually go in and I'm going to say, all right, now we're going to say what the correct answer is. I'm going to go right here and voila. And now I can do this for each question. You can share this with students, okay, and they are not going to see this, but this will give instantaneous feedback, and it's called Class Kick and is completely free. So that shows you how you can actually be flexible with your options. The next thing to think about is thinking like a doctor, right? Knowing the purpose of your assessment. Is it for students or is it for the teacher? You might think, well, what are you talking about? If it's for the teacher, it might be an assessment for learning or a formative assessment. If it's for the student, it might be an assessment of learning or a summative assessment, right? And there are different reasons for those types of assessments. Formative assessments often happen during instruction to help us, well, make some changes during instruction. As a summative assessment usually happens at the end of some type of cycle, like a chapter, a unit, or even a test. So if you want to see some different examples of what the purpose of your assessment is and some examples of assessments for learning or of learning, check that out. The other thing is providing clear feedback. So feedback is so important, and so we've learned from Hattie's research that providing different types of feedback and being very clear in our expectations is so important. So there's different ways that you could possibly do that. And last but not least, don't forget about including opportunities for students to reflect and self-evaluate. Things like exam wrappers are really helpful for students to sort of see, okay, how did I do? Like, how well did I feel on this exam? How much time did I spend? And what tools did I use? This is a non-graded activity, but it also serves as sort of a market research piece where you can see oh, you know what? None of my students are using Quizlet flashcards. Then why are we wasting our time using that, right? So that's something that you can do as well. Even doing things like a peer feedback choice board, or even just thought protocols. I love Project Zero's thinking routine toolbox because it provides us with different types of ways of reflecting. And so we can reflect and make that connection between today's lesson and tomorrow's. So just to sort of go back and talk about what exactly we've talked about here, as we said, 8 tips for designing UDL assessments. It begins with being construct relevant, measuring what you're intending to measure, looking for potential barriers in engagement, representation, action, expression, planning for variability. So thinking about, okay, what are some of those checkpoints that we talked about along the way that help us plan for UDL lessons? And then scaffolds and supports, saying, you know what? Do our students need additional scaffolds and supports to help them through this particular assessment? And then providing flexible options. Are we flexible in the product or the process? And thinking like a doctor, knowing the purpose of our assessment is so important, and providing clear feedback. Meaning, hey, do you differentiate your feedback? Do you use a rubric? What do you do? And then, last but not least, reflection, providing opportunities for self reflection and self evaluation.